What if I told you that one of the most elegant mansions in New Orleans hides a secret so horrifying that it still haunts the city nearly 2 centuries later? What if I told you that behind the refined facade of high society lived a woman whose cruelty was so unimaginable that her very name became synonymous with evil itself? In 1834, a fire at 1140 Royal Street would expose atrocities that shocked even the hardened residents of antebellum New Orleans. The discovery would send an entire city into a rage, force a prominent socialite to flee in the dead of night, and leave behind a legacy of horror that continues to this day. This is the true story of Madame Delphine LaLaurie and the mansion that became known as one of the most haunted places in America. But before we dive into this tale of unthinkable cruelty, I need you to do something for me. If you're brave enough to hear this story to the end, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, you'll want to be notified when we explore more dark histories like this one. And if you think you can handle what we're about to uncover, leave a comment below telling me which haunted location you want us to investigate next. But I'm warning you now, what happened in the LaLaurie mansion will stay with you long after this video ends. The year was 1834, and New Orleans was a city of contradictions. Wealth and poverty, beauty and decay, all existing side by side in the sultry Louisiana heat. But no contradiction was more striking than the one that existed within the walls of the mansion owned by Dr. Louis LaLaurie and his wife, Madame Delphine. Are you ready to discover what horrors were hidden behind those elegant French doors? Because once we open them, there's no going back. Chapter 1: The Flames Reveal the Horror. Madame Marie Delphine McCarty LaLaurie was the epitome of New Orleans high society. Born into wealth and privilege, she had married well, twice in fact, before becoming the wife of Dr. Louis LaLaurie. Their mansion at 1140 Royal Street in the French Quarter was a testament to their status. 3 stories of architectural elegance, adorned with intricate ironwork balconies and grand windows that caught the morning light. The couple was known for hosting lavish soirees that drew the cream of New Orleans society. Ladies in silk gowns would glide across polished floors while gentlemen in tailored coats discussed business and politics. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the finest French wines flowed freely. To the outside world, the LaLauries represented everything refined about antebellum Louisiana. But whispers had begun to circulate through the narrow streets of the French Quarter. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones about the treatment of the LaLaurie slaves. Unlike other wealthy households where enslaved people might be seen coming and going, running errands or accompanying their owners, the LaLaurie slaves seemed to vanish into the mansion and rarely emerge. The first public incident occurred when a neighbor witnessed a young slave girl, no more than 8 years old, being chased across the mansion's roof by Madame LaLaurie herself, brandishing a whip. The terrified child, in her desperation to escape, fell from the roof to her death in the courtyard below. This incident was reported to authorities, and Madame LaLaurie was forced to pay a fine and sell some of her slaves at public auction. But the slaves she was forced to sell were quietly purchased by her relatives and friends, then secretly returned to the mansion. The authorities looked the other way, as they often did when wealthy white citizens were involved. On April 10, 1834, smoke began billowing from the LaLaurie mansion. The fire had started in the kitchen, and neighbors rushed to help fight the blaze. But when they tried to gain access to all areas of the house to ensure everyone's safety, Madame LaLaurie became strangely resistant. She insisted that certain areas were off-limits and that all the slaves were accounted for. Judge Jacques-François Canonge, who lived nearby, was among those who insisted on a thorough search of the premises. Despite Madame LaLaurie's protests, he and others made their way to a locked door in the slave quarters. When they broke down the door, what they discovered would haunt New Orleans forever. The smell hit them first, a nauseating mixture of human waste, decay, and something far worse. In the dim light filtering through barred windows, they saw what could only be described as a torture chamber. 7 slaves were found chained to the walls in positions that defied human anatomy. Their limbs had been broken and reset at impossible angles. Some had been suspended from the ceiling for so long that their joints had become permanently dislocated. One man's bones had been broken and reset so many times that he resembled a human crab, according to witness accounts. A woman was found with her limbs stretched and broken, her body bearing evidence of systematic torture that had gone on for months, perhaps years. Another victim had been subjected to crude medical experiments. Her skull had been opened and her brain was visible, yet she was still alive. The witnesses, hardened men who had seen violence and death, were physically ill at the sight. Several had to leave the room to vomit. Judge Canonge would later write that in all his years of legal work, he had never encountered anything so systematically cruel. But what chilled the rescuers to their core was the realization that some of these people were still alive. They had been kept in this condition, tortured and mutilated, not as punishment for any crime, but apparently for the sadistic pleasure of their captors. As word spread through the streets of New Orleans, a crowd began to gather outside the mansion. What they would demand next would send Madame LaLaurie fleeing into the night, never to return to the city again. Chapter 2. The Torture Room. What Witnesses Claimed to See. The full extent of the horrors discovered in the LaLaurie mansion only became clear as more witnesses entered that hellish chamber. Dr. Louis LaLaurie was notably absent during the fire, leaving many to wonder if he had fled in advance, knowing what would be discovered. According to newspaper accounts published in the days following the discovery, the tortured slaves showed evidence of systematic brutality that suggested a methodical approach to human suffering. The New Orleans Bee reported that one enslaved woman had her arms amputated and sewn back on in different positions. Another had been forced into a tiny cage where she had been kept bent double for so long that she could no longer straighten her limbs. Witnesses described seeing crude surgical instruments scattered throughout the room, suggesting that Dr. LaLaurie may have used his medical knowledge to keep the victims alive longer during their torture. Some accounts describe primitive lobotomies performed on conscious victims, with holes drilled into skulls and the brains stirred with sharp instruments. One of the most disturbing discoveries was a man who had been castrated and had his fingernails pulled out. His body bore evidence of being flayed alive in strips, the wounds carefully treated to prevent death from blood loss. The precision of the mutilations suggested someone with medical knowledge had inflicted them. A woman was found with her skin peeled away in patterns, as if someone had been using her body as a canvas for their cruelty. Her lips had been sewn shut, and her hands had been bound behind her back for so long that the rope had grown into her flesh. When rescuers tried to free her, she could only communicate through guttural sounds and hand gestures, having been silenced for an unknown period. Perhaps most horrifying were the accounts of a man who had been subjected to what witnesses described as human taxidermy. His skin had been removed in places and replaced with animal hide, sewn directly onto his flesh. The precision of the work suggested someone familiar with preservation techniques, lending credence to theories that Dr. LaLaurie had been conducting twisted medical experiments. The room itself told a story of prolonged suffering. Chains were embedded in the walls at various heights, suggesting victims of different ages and sizes had been imprisoned there. Bloodstains covered the floors in patterns that indicated bodies had been dragged and positioned repeatedly. In one corner, witnesses found what appeared to be an improvised operating table, stained with old blood and equipped with leather restraints. According to the testimony of Judge Canonge and others present, some victims appeared to have been deliberately kept alive through their torture. Crude medical care had been provided. Wounds had been cauterized to prevent fatal blood loss, and some showed signs of forced feeding. This wasn't random violence or punishment for misbehavior. This was systematic torture designed to maximize suffering while preventing death. The New Orleans Advertiser reported that one victim, when asked how long she had been confined, could only indicate a very long time through gestures. Another paper, The Courier, described victims who appeared to have been subjected to crude amputations and reattachments, with limbs sewn on backwards or in impossible positions. As news of the discoveries spread beyond the immediate witnesses, more details emerged from neighbors and former associates. Some claimed to have heard screams coming from the mansion late at night, sounds they had dismissed as the wind or their imagination. Others recalled the strange disappearance of LaLaurie slaves over the years, always explained away by claims that they had been sold or had run away. A cook who had worked in the mansion before the fire came forward to authorities, claiming that Madame LaLaurie would often disappear into the slave quarters for hours at a time, always alone, and would emerge in an unusually calm and satisfied mood. The cook also reported that Dr. LaLaurie would sometimes request unusual medical supplies that seemed inappropriate for his regular practice. But even as these details emerged, Madame LaLaurie herself had vanished into the chaos of that terrible night, leaving behind only questions and the echoes of unimaginable suffering. Chapter 3. The Aftermath and the Disappearance of Madame LaLaurie. Word of the discovery spread through New Orleans like wildfire. By nightfall on April 10th, an angry mob had gathered outside the LaLaurie mansion. The crowd, estimated at over 4,000 people, was unlike anything the city had seen before. It included not just the working classes, but respectable citizens, merchants, and even members of high society who were horrified by what had been revealed. The mob's rage was focused not just on the cruelty they had discovered, but on the betrayal of their trust. The LaLauries had been welcomed into the highest circles of society, invited into homes trusted with social standing. The revelation that such monsters had walked among them, had dined at their tables and danced at their parties, was almost as shocking as the torture itself. As the crowd grew larger and more violent, they began throwing stones at the mansion windows, shattering the elegant glass that had once reflected candlelight during grand soirees. They demanded that Madame LaLaurie be brought out to face justice, but she was nowhere to be found. According to multiple accounts, including reports in the New Orleans papers of the time, Madame LaLaurie had fled the mansion during the confusion of the fire. Some witnesses claimed to have seen a carriage racing away from the mansion in the early hours of the morning, carrying several figures in dark clothing. Others reported seeing Madame LaLaurie herself, still dressed in her fine clothes but with her face covered, being hurried into a waiting vehicle. The mob, denied their primary target, turned their fury on the mansion itself. They broke down the front door and surged inside, destroying furniture, artwork and anything else that represented the wealth and status the LaLauries had used to hide their crimes. Crystal chandeliers were smashed, oil paintings were torn from their frames, and elegant furnishings were thrown from the upper-story windows. The New Orleans Bee reported that the crowd's destruction was thorough and methodical. They seemed to understand that they were not just destroying property, but erasing the very symbols of the respectability that had allowed such horrors to continue undetected. By dawn, the interior of the mansion was completely gutted. But what happened to Madame LaLaurie herself remains one of New Orleans' greatest mysteries. The most widely accepted account suggests that she fled to Mobile, Alabama, then boarded a ship bound for France. Some reports placed her in Paris, living under an assumed name among French aristocrats who were unaware of her past. Other accounts suggest she may have remained in the American South, possibly in Alabama or Mississippi, where her family connections could have provided protection. A few unconfirmed reports placed her in New York City, living quietly but comfortably on funds she had managed to transfer before her escape. What is certain is that she was never brought to trial for her crimes. The legal system of the time offered little protection for enslaved people, and even the most horrific abuse was often treated as a property crime rather than a crime against persons. Still, the public outrage was so intense that even the corrupt officials of antebellum New Orleans might have been forced to act had she remained within their reach. Dr. Louis LaLaurie's fate is even more mysterious. Some accounts suggest he fled with his wife, while others claim he had left New Orleans before the fire, possibly aware of what would be discovered. There are unverified reports that he died shortly after the scandal, though whether from illness, accident, or violence is unknown. The surviving victims of the LaLaurie torture chamber were taken to a local jail, not for their protection, but because authorities didn't know what else to do with them. Several died within days of their rescue, their bodies finally succumbing to the trauma they had endured. Those who survived were reportedly cared for by local charitable organizations, but their ultimate fate is lost to history. The mansion itself stood empty for years, its broken windows and damaged walls serving as a reminder of that terrible night. But even an empty house could not contain the horror of what had happened within its walls. Chapter 4. The Haunting Legacy of the Mansion. The LaLaurie mansion stood empty for decades after that terrible night in 1834, but it was never truly vacant. Almost immediately after the mob's destruction, people began reporting strange phenomena in and around the building. Passers-by claimed to hear screams echoing from the empty rooms, always at night, always filled with the kind of anguish that seemed to come from beyond the grave. Local newspapers began documenting these reports as early as 1837. The New Orleans Times-Picayune published accounts from residents of Royal Street who insisted they could hear chains rattling in the upper floors and moaning voices calling out in languages they couldn't understand. Some claimed to see figures moving behind the broken windows, shadowy forms that appeared to be in constant motion, as if fleeing from some unseen tormentor. The mansion changed hands multiple times over the following decades, but no owner could remain for long. A succession of tenants reported the same phenomena: unexplained noises, sudden drops in temperature, and the overwhelming sensation of being watched. One family lasted only 3 days before abandoning their lease, claiming that invisible hands had touched them while they slept. In the 1870s, the building was converted into a school for young ladies. The experiment lasted less than a year. Students reported seeing apparitions in the hallways, figures bearing the twisted postures and mutilated forms that matched descriptions of LaLaurie's victims. Teachers complained of hearing children crying in empty rooms, and several students claimed to have been pushed downstairs by invisible forces. The most persistent reports centered on the 3rd floor, the area closest to where the torture chamber had been discovered. Witnesses described seeing a woman in fine dress standing at the windows, always facing outward toward the street, as if searching for something or someone. Many believed this figure was Madame LaLaurie herself, somehow bound to the scene of her crimes. During the early 20th century, the building served briefly as an apartment house. Tenants reported that certain rooms could never be kept warm, regardless of the season or the heating system used. Others claimed that mirrors would crack spontaneously and that photographs taken inside would show additional figures that hadn't been visible when the pictures were taken. One of the most documented incidents occurred in the 1930s when the building was being used as a furniture store. The owner reported that items would move overnight, always ending up arranged in disturbing patterns. Chairs would be found stacked in impossible configurations, and mannequins would be discovered positioned as if they were chained or tortured. The business closed after employees refused to work alone in the building. Modern paranormal investigators have recorded electromagnetic anomalies throughout the building, with the strongest readings concentrated in the areas where the slave quarters once stood. Temperature variations of up to 20 degrees have been documented within single rooms, often forming patterns that investigators claim correspond to the locations where victims were found in 1834. Today, the LaLaurie mansion operates as private condominiums, though the turnover rate remains unusually high. Current residents rarely discuss their experiences publicly, but property records show that units are frequently sold after very short periods of ownership. Local real estate agents privately acknowledge that the building's history makes it difficult to market, despite its prime location in the French Quarter. Tour guides regularly bring groups to stand outside the mansion, sharing the story of Madame LaLaurie and her victims. Visitors often report feeling nauseated or dizzy while standing on Royal Street in front of the building, and some claim to hear faint sounds of distress coming from within. The story of the LaLaurie mansion has become more than just a tale of historical cruelty. It has become a reminder that evil, once unleashed, leaves marks that can never be completely erased. The screams that echoed from that torture chamber in 1834 seem to echo still, carrying across nearly 2 centuries to remind us that some horrors are too profound to ever truly die. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, the LaLaurie mansion stands as proof that the worst monsters are often those who walk among us in plain sight, hiding their true nature behind masks of respectability and charm. And sometimes, just sometimes, the walls remember everything. What do you think? Are the reported hauntings the spirits of LaLaurie's victims, still seeking justice after all these years? Or is the mansion simply a place where the memory of human cruelty has become so intense that it seems to take on a life of its own? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories from the dark corners of history. Epilogue: when horror becomes history. Time doesn't bury all things. Some stories resist silence. Some houses, no matter how renovated or repainted, never really let go of the past. The LaLaurie mansion is not just a monument to human cruelty, it's a reminder of how easily evil can thrive behind the veil of status, beauty, and respectability. Nearly 2 centuries have passed since neighbors kicked down that door and stepped into a chamber of horrors. The blood is gone. The chains have been removed. The victims' names, if they were ever recorded, have faded from any surviving record. And yet, the house still stands. It has changed owners, functions, and faces. It has been a school, an apartment building, a furniture store, and now high-end residences. But every attempt to domesticate the building has come with whispers. Of footsteps where no one walks, of crying behind walls that shouldn't hold any memory. Some call it haunted. Others call it cursed. But maybe the truth is simpler, maybe places remember. The crimes of Madame Delphine LaLaurie weren't committed in some faraway, war-torn land. They happened in the heart of a thriving city. In a home admired by the elite. In a society that looked the other way until the smell of fire forced its eyes open. The horror was not an aberration of its time. It was the product of a system that allowed it to exist, to flourish, and to go unpunished. And that may be the most terrifying part of all. When people speak of the LaLaurie mansion now, they often focus on the ghosts. The spirits of tortured souls, the cold spots, the shadows. But perhaps the real ghost isn't one that drifts through the halls at night. Perhaps it's the ghost of the society that allowed Delphine LaLaurie to host galas upstairs while human suffering echoed beneath her floorboards. Perhaps the ghost is the question that never leaves us. How many more doors have never been opened? For all the headlines, books, and ghost tours, the victims of the LaLaurie mansion were never given justice. Their pain was consumed as spectacle, their stories twisted into legend. They became part of New Orleans folklore, but they were people. People who were owned, broken, and silenced. And Madame LaLaurie? She died wealthy and free, buried in Paris beneath a name not stained by her crimes. History for a time let her disappear. But history has a way of correcting itself. slowly, painfully, but inevitably. We tell these stories not because they entertain us but because they remind us that horror isn't always fanged and howling. Sometimes it dines by candlelight. Sometimes it wears silk and speaks French. And sometimes if we're not careful it returns. So the next time you walk by a grand old house with tall windows and iron balconies, remember this: not everything that looks beautiful is safe. And not every nightmare stays in the past. Because in places like the LaLaurie mansion, the past never really leaves.